BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. On Mondays, I do a regular segment about the Zodiac Killer, who was an unidentified serial killer that operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop something down below if you have something to say about the Zodiac Killer. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and I am your host, Blackbox Ned. Now, many of you will know that there is a panel discussion show that is available on the channel, Mysteries with Mr. Belgique, which is run by Jerome from Belgium. And there were two recent guests on the panel discussion show, Melissa Tappa and Jeff Thornton, who are the webmasters of ZodiacKillerBomb.com. And they have a Zodiac killer suspect named Loring Dale Hill. Loring Dale Hill was Jeff's grandfather. He has since passed away. And they also run a Facebook group called Zodiac Killer and Me. And Melissa and Jeff are in some hot water with some recent allegations that they have withheld information that would have exonerated their suspect, Loring Dale Hill. And it goes a little bit beyond that. The list of allegations gets bigger and bigger. They have been accused of doing this for profit. They have been accused of trying to build a brand around their Zodiac killer suspect. And I was watching the most recent panel discussion show. I was not a participant on it because of some time constraints, but I've been on the channel many times, Mysteries with Mr. Belgique. And during the most recent panel discussion show, I noticed that there was some type of confrontational atmosphere among some of the panelists, particularly Melissa and Jeff, and Drewzer, aka Andrew Gray, being one of the others. And it seemed like he was taking a very strong stance against Melissa and Jeff and the proposition that their suspect, Loring Dale Hill, was the Zodiac killer. Now, some background info on Loring Dale Hill, and firstly I should say, I've had the opportunity to interview Jeff and Melissa multiple times. I have episodes about Loring Dale Hill here on this channel, challenge episodes, as well as them just laying out their theory and exploring it. Please feel free to go through some of the content here on Black Box Online Radio if you're curious. But to provide a nutshell version of Loring Dale Hill's suspect profile, he was a career naval serviceman. He was a naval aviation mechanic. He was a helicopter pilot. He was stationed on the USS Enterprise from January 7th of 1969 to July 2nd of 1969. He survived the famous fire on the Enterprise that took place on January 14th of that year, 1969. And again, he is somebody who was reportedly very abusive at home. He had a long history of family violence. But let's look at some of the allegations against Jeff and Melissa. And this is a statement that was written out by Drewzer. And he says, "Hey, Ned, it is sad, aggravating, and from their perspective, I suppose, up for interpretation. It was after the last panel that others they have fought with came to me with the following information. They have known for some time, since at least July of last year, that their suspect moved to Texas in late December of 1970 and have no reason to believe that he returned to the Bay Area to send the confirmed LA letter on March 13th of 1971. And this is the letter that does talk about the LA Times, but this is also referred to as the Pleasanton letter because it was mailed from California. Now, this is something that people will encounter when they're proposing suspects, no matter whom their suspect was, because the Zodiac killer didn't only commit the murders in California, the letters were also mailed from California. So sometimes people have suspects who are not in the Bay Area at the time, and they need to find explanations how to tie their theories together. It seems that their suspect, Loring Dale Hill, also re-enlisted in the Navy on September 6 of 1969. I confronted Melissa Tappa about the Texas aspect, and that she basically said, well, the letters slowed down at that point, and it's still possible that he returned. For me, not mentioning any of this over the course of multiple multi-hour conversations essentially dedicated to the Hill timeline was disingenuous. I would have spoken with them about the issues in the timeline if they had been forthcoming. There are issues, unlikelihoods, and unknowables with every theory, which is fine, but instead they led us to believe that they had confirmed his whereabouts and viability. There is delusional thinking, and then there is bad faith. This is the latter. I won't judge any podcaster who wants to continue speaking with them. Perhaps they deserve to defend themselves publicly, but I am done. I no longer trust them, and I feel like they used us for publicity. Those are some very big allegations. And the things that have been expanded upon in some other discussions is that Melissa and Jeff have been accused of putting this material out there for profit. They've also been accused of trying to build a brand around their Zodiac killer suspect, Loringdale Hill. But I'm not someone who is going to rush to judgment, and I've definitely wanted a second opinion, and I wanted to hear Melissa and Jeff give their side of the story. Firstly, they even stated on the most recent panel discussion show that they are not doing this for profit. They have spent $20,000 of their own money investigating this mystery. And I think that Melissa has articulated her stance very easily, and that is that there were not an enormous amount of communications in 1971, and it is physically possible for somebody to go from Texas to California. And what she actually believes is that Loringdale Hill went back to California to participate in training exercises with the Navy, if I've understood correctly. She also points out that she is a traveling businesswoman and has made 25 business trips over the course of the last 12 months. And yes, it is physically possible to do that. And not only do we have the March 13th Pleasanton letter, but we also have the peek through the pines card, although some people will dispute that one's authenticity. If you had to ask me right now, I believe that both of those 1971 communications were authentic. Now, again, I do not believe that their suspect has been exonerated based on this timeline issue alone. I do not believe that it is even appropriate to say that they have done anything fraudulent or scandalous. And I also don't believe that they have misrepresented the situation. What I do believe and do propose is this is something that a lot of people deal with when they put forward suspects, and their suspect does look a little bit less credible and less viable because of these timeline issues. The Zodiac killer was mailing letters into 1971, and by December of 1970, their suspect was not in the Bay Area. That is definitely a cause for consideration as to how and why their suspect may have not been the Zodiac killer. I repeat, may have not been the Zodiac killer. But what do you think, based on this timeline issue alone, do you think that this suspect should be eliminated? Should he still be considered? And what a lot of people are proposing in the comments section, just reading through what you guys are saying, it is that you can comprehend some of the reasons why they suspect him of being the Zodiac, but you just simply think that the hard physical evidence is not there. I mean, I read what you guys send into the comment section here on Black Box Online Radio, and I would like to thank everyone who does propose different types of ideas. It is all greatly appreciated. Now, I'd like to move on to something different that I've never discussed before on this channel. And actually, many of you guys frequently ask me, how do you come up with content about the Zodiac killer every week for Zodiac Monday? And firstly, I would like to say that I now have a copy of the book One Night in October by Gerald Gregory Doan, and this is a book that I've wanted to read for quite some time. It's one that came out earlier this year, and as you see, new books are being written about the Zodiac killer all the time, and I have to give credit to Sam Fisher, who shared the website with me, ZodiacKillerTruth.net, which has 94 posts at the time of this recording, and I'm tempted to say 94 articles, but this is a website that is done more in the blog post tradition, so some of these posts are very short. And again, 94 posts that I have to work through, and I'm only going to talk about post number 3 in this episode. So as you see, there is no shortage of Zodiac Killer content on the internet, and this is a website that is going to talk about a specific Zodiac killer suspect, but the suspect is not mentioned in the early posts, and we can talk about Zodiac killer suspects all day long and into the wee hours of the morning, but I think it's always interesting to hear what people have to say about different aspects of the Zodiac killer mystery. And when I was going through this website, ZodiacKillerTruth.net, and again, you can find this post 3 of 94 at the time of this recording, there was a video that had been incorporated into the post about the Zodiac killer's bus bomb diagram. Because the Zodiac didn't only write letters, he also created the very famous ciphers and the greeting cards, of course. I just mentioned the peek through the pines card, if that is indeed a Zodiac killer communication. But the bus bomb diagram is something that I talked about a lot in the spring of this year, especially when I interviewed Paul Brookbanks, who had a lot of observations, and that interview is in the playlist called The Zodiac Killer's Architecture. You can also watch Paul's videos on the bus bomb diagram on his channel, paulscape72. This video on zodiackillertruth.net was proposing that the bus bomb diagram is actually a map. And it is a map of Mare Island, the naval base in Northern California. And I'm going to play the clip, and then I am going to give a direct response. And I also want to know, what do you guys think about it? Once more time, zodiackillertruth.net, post 3.
Show you how the Zodiac bus bomb letter from 1970 is actually a map of Mare Island Naval Shipyard that is directing the female member, E, of the Zodiac, who owns a VW bus, where to pick up cardboard tubes, A and B, that are going to have some type of probably photo electronic surveillance information or some other kind of classified information, right? So forget all these different instructions, but this is how you do it. So you got to do this first. Okay, you have to invert the map. So we got to turn it that way. Let's bring it back. And I'm doing this with one hand. So we're going to stretch that out. Okay, so we inverted it. And then we're going to need to turn it sideways. All right, and then we'll drag it over here a little bit more. Okay, so now this area right here represents this area right here. Okay, so from here to actually directly across to here without showing this bottom part. All right, so on the bus bomb map, you see that right there? That's actually a P for parking. And then it says car battery when it's the other way. So at Mare Island, there's the larger parking space, right? And then there's a smaller parking space, like right over here to the corner. See what I'm saying? So you have this parking space to this parking space. So on the map, what they're saying is, it says when this is turned around, it says a line of bombs or a series of bombs. Whatever we're saying is, okay, this is the big parking space. Like, so there's like, you know, a lot of cars over here. So it's the big parking space. I need you to go to the small parking space. So that's where this car battery thing. And then the first package will be over there. So that's A. So over here, it's saying, here's the sun, right? Or star, whatever. It's saying start, you know, get it, start in the bus, in the VW bus, and I want you to drive to A. All right? To get to A, start in the big parking lot and then drive into the little parking lot and it'll be there. So a civilian can get into this parking lot. You know, just come in here, right, or whatever, and then just drive over to this smaller parking lot. And then I don't know if this building was there or not, but there's something over here that has the information. And then you come over here and it gets kind of weird because you see this thing and I'm like, what's that? And I couldn't quite figure out what it is. But what we say it is drive out of the parking lot, right, to get to B. B is actually down here at Waterfront and Railroad Avenue. So you could come out of the parking lot, go down Railroad, and just get to Waterfront and pick up the B package. But Railroad Avenue is on base. So for some reason, they wanted her to go out to this little circle. And I'll show you where that is. So you see how this kind of like this little bump right here, it wasn't actually square. It's kind of roundish. That wasn't an accident. That was like, okay, take the little turn out. Then you could come down what's called Azure Avenue. Doesn't allow you to go straight over the railroad. It dips below, and then you come back up to Waterfront, and you could get to Package B without being on the base. But so on the bus bomb map, it says B's over here, and you go around the little loop, but it doesn't show you the dip. Because if it showed you the dip, that would give it away. So they just got down to here and said, yeah, it's on Waterfront, but you got to go down because you can't get to Railroad. So if they forced her to go out here, she would realize she can't get to Railroad to get to Waterfront, and that she would just drop down and come back up and grab Package B. So all the writing is instructions as to what to do.
And one more time, that was from zodiackiller.net. And I rarely hold back what I think here on Black Box Online Radio. And I'm not going to lie to you guys, when I first watched that video, I was thinking, this is absolutely ridiculous. This idea that the bus bomb or that any type of bomb diagram that the Zodiac Killer was using was actually a map of the naval base. And it's not the proposition itself, it's that you heard at the very beginning of that video, he was drawing out his own map, and then he completely cut off the bottom of the highlighted map that was up there. And it's not simply that he was taking a different pathway, it's that there was a road that was on that highlighted section. There was a building that was going around, that the road was going around, so those things were there for a reason, and it seemed like he was just taking a pair of safety scissors and cutting around the parts that would not fit into his theory. However, once I watched the entire video, it began to make a little bit more sense, and I saw that he was proposing that that highlight there was simply done by Google Maps, and that he was using a real road there, then went all the way to the waterfront, and that was using the, well, it's called railroad road, so to speak. But there was a reason why he was doing that, so it appears that there is a rhyme and reason to what this person is doing. At the very least, I can follow it in a logical sequence, and I wouldn't say anything bad about anybody who's making an honest attempt to try and analyze the facts, even if it's unconfirmed. I mean, I can't just simply verify that, oh yeah, this is exactly what the Zodiac Killer was thinking, and of course I'm going to have doubts about something like that. However, at the very least, I can follow the examinations, and I think there are reasons why he cut off the map in that particular way. But what do you think? What do you think about this video? And you can hear more about this at zodiackillertruth.net. Now, the next thing that I have for you is actually something that is very big. This could be a big breakthrough in the case of Nikki Benedict, who was murdered in 1967. Nikki Benedict is a possible Zodiac Killer victim. She was murdered on May 1st of 1967 at approximately 6:30 p.m. in Poway, California, after walking home from a friend's house, walking down a dirt road, and she was stabbed to death, and she was found by the son of a local butcher. And there is a suspect that has been entering into the discussions, and I have to give full credit to Nicholas Broughton, aka Nikki B, who is more famous in the D.B. Cooper circles, but he has been looking into a suspect for the crimes in Southern California, and that suspect is named Flake Crawford Casto. And I've mentioned him before on the Zodiac Killer News Report, and it really happened in a roundabout way. For example, the Nancy Drew channel did a video on how, hey, there was this resident of Riverside, California, and his name fits into the Zodiac Killer's Z13 cipher. If done in a certain way, you wouldn't be using the whole name, Flake Crawford Casto. But I did agree that, that name fit into the cipher. But what was so much more interesting was that Flake Crawford Casto seemed like he was a much more viable suspect for some of the crimes that took place in Southern California prior to the Zodiac Killer's debut in 1968. And these would be the murder of Sherry Jo Bates in 1966 and the murder of Nikki Benedict in 1967. Again, this is a very twisted way of getting to the conclusion. Now, as far as being a suspect in the Sherry Jo Bates case, it's possible that Flake Crawford Casto was either in Las Vegas or San Diego at the time of the Bates murder, and Sherry Jo Bates was, of course, murdered in Riverside, California, not San Diego or Las Vegas. But with the murder of Nikki Benedict, it appears that he was a real suspect. He was someone who had a criminal past. He may have been on leave from the Navy at the time. And again, he was questioned by the authorities, and that they looked into him, and maybe he was someone who was questioned, but they just didn't have the sufficient evidence to bring about a warrant. But this was back in 1967, and according to Nikki B., who has shared this information with me, they have the DNA of Nikki Benedict's killer, Nikki Benedict, who was murdered in 1967, thought to have been a possible Zodiac killer victim. And primarily, I first learned about her because of the accusation that Gareth Penn was both the Zodiac killer and the murderer of Nikki Benedict. But if anything, this is one step closer to bringing closure to her case, no matter whom the killer was. And next, I would like to give a shout out to multiple people who shared an article with me from the website Ostello Volante that is talking about Giuseppe Bevilacqua as a Zodiac killer suspect. And I was quite surprised that multiple people sent me this article because it is not a recent one. It was actually written in January of 2024, and right now we're in December of 2024. Giuseppe Bevilacqua is also known as Joe Bevilacqua, and that's how I'll be referring to him in this episode. And I've done one episode about him in the past. If you go to the Zodiac Killer News Report for September 11th of 2023, you can hear a more introductory statement on Joe Bevilacqua as a Zodiac killer suspect. But a writer named Francesco Amaconi has proposed that Joe Bevilacqua was the Zodiac killer and also an Italian serial killer called the Monster of Florence. And one person who has heavily disputed this is Mike Rodelli, author of In the Shadow of Mount Diablo. And Mike Rodelli has also appeared on this channel, Black Box Online Radio, to discuss this set of challenges. And you can hear that in the episode, The Zodiac Killer and the Monster of Florence. And it is an on-camera interview that I did with Mike Rodelli. But this is also about DNA evidence. The title of this article is Joe Bevilacqua's DNA Profile Sent to U.S. Authorities. In November of 2023, I, meaning Francesco Amaconi, transmitted the genetic profile of Joseph Bevilacqua, 1935 to 2022, to police departments in charge of the Zodiac killer case, as well as his other possible crimes for defense investigations. I also sent it to the FBI together with the result of my journalistic investigations and the solutions to the ciphers of the Zodiac killer considered unsolved so far. Anagram of the Z408, the Mount Diablo code, the Zodiac's name, I think that refers to the Z13 cipher, and the Halloween riddle. Bevilacqua was a former ABMC superintendent of the Florence American Cemetery and witness at the Pacciani trial, and was reported to the police by me and admission of guilt on the Zodiac and Monster of Florence crimes in 2018. His DNA has never before been compared with the samples collected in the investigation on Zodiac, nor entered for control in the vast FBI database. Bevilacqua's DNA was collected in 2020 by the Siena DA's office, not Florence, on the initiative of the Deputy DA Nicola Marini, with the assistance of police officers Carlo Brandini, Nicola Leonardi, and colleagues of the Judicial Police. Okay, now this article is going to go on for a while, but I want to get to the important points here. But this brings up the question of, why would somebody suspect the Zodiac killer of being the Monster of Florence? Why would somebody suspect Joe Bevilacqua of being both serial killers? Well, Joe Bevilacqua was an Italian-American, and the first Monster of Florence crime took place in 1968. Allegedly, reportedly, it appears that there is a ballistics match between a 1968 murder and the Monster of Florence crimes, which came much later. But then, the killer just goes silent or something like that? Maybe the killer went to California and became the Zodiac killer in 1968 and 69, and then the Monster of Florence doesn't start operating until 1974. And the final confirmed Zodiac letter was written and mailed in 1974. So there are some very suspicious things with the timelines. And this would have to be some type of theory about how you would have somebody like the Zodiac killer who's going to be hunting couples in parked cars, shooting at them and running away, and that this serial killer would have to have escalated in deviant behavior because the monster of Florence was a very vicious individual who mutilated the genital regions of the victims post-mortem, and I mean, those types of behaviors just aren't present in the Zodiac world. But it appears that Francesco Amiconi is trying to get the authorities to do some type of DNA comparison. But you guys know this better than anyone. All you people who have been following Black Box Online Radio over the years will know they might not even have the Zodiac Killer's DNA. In fact, there's a very high chance that they do not have any credible sample of the Zodiac Killer's DNA. Now, somebody had proposed recently that the Zodiac Killer was sitting in Paul Stein's taxi, and it's quite possible that he could have been sweating, and there could have been sweat DNA built up on the seat cushions inside the taxi. Now, that could be something. Another thing that we've discussed recently on the channel about how to try and solve the Zodiac Killer mystery would relate to fingerprints, and there could be partial fingerprint matches among multiple crime scenes, so that gives us some reason to hope that they might actually have a lot more forensic material to work with and a much higher chance of solving the Zodiac Killer mystery than previously believed. But next I would like to give a shout out to Vincent McConnell, who runs the channel New Cokes 2024, and Vincent has been putting out a lot of content about the Zodiac Killer as well as other true crime cases. And right now I would like to respond to the video that he did on Is My Suspect the Guy? Is My Person of Interest the Guy? Because he was telling the story of a Golden State Killer suspect named Mr. Y. And we know who the Golden State Killer was. The Golden State Killer was identified as Joseph D'Angelo. And I've also interviewed Vincent about the Golden State Killer here on this channel. But let's look at his claim about this other Golden State Killer suspect, Mr. Y, and just how do people build these types of circumstantial cases. Prior to the arrest of Joseph D'Angelo in the Golden State Killer case, Mr. Y was on the radar. The reasons to suspect him is that prior to becoming the Golden State Killer, there were a set of crimes that have all been attributed to this individual. First, there were the Visalia ransacker crimes, then there was the East Area Rapist, and then the original Night Stalker, and those names were pushed together into EARONS, E-A-R-O-N-S, East Area Rapist Original Night Stalker. And a suspect, who is not publicly named, he is simply known as Mr. Y, came on the radar. He owned property near all of the East Area Rapist crime scenes, or the original Night Stalker crime scenes, excuse me. He was someone who actually ended up being at the same college as Joseph D'Angelo, so any type of links traced back to the college would go to both of those suspects. He personally knew one of the victims of the East Area Rapist, and he also had his fingerprints found at multiple Visalia ransacker crime scenes. And I mean, Vincent was saying something to the effect of, if they didn't catch Joseph D'Angelo, it would be like, yeah, this guy is totally the person. Personal connection to the victims. He has property near where the crimes are taking place. He has his fingerprints found at the crime scene. Yeah, it turns out he's just some other guy who lived in Northern California that had some type of reason to be in these places. And as previously stated, he's definitely in the exact geographic areas as Joseph D'Angelo. And the Golden State Killer affected over 100 people. I mean, we're talking about, if you include the Visalia ransacker crimes, he committed over 100 burglaries, over 50 rapes, and over a dozen murders. So that the fact that he knew one of the victims, probability would not be shocking in that case. But the whole point is, you could build a circumstantial case for that Mr. Y being the Golden State Killer, but it wasn't him. And the thing that Vincent said on that channel that I thought was so fascinating was, everything that I just told you about personal connection to the victims, owning property near the crime scenes, his fingerprints found at the crime scene, well, that's a bigger circumstantial case than you would have for Zodiac Killer suspects such as Richard Gaikowski or such as Don Chaney. But guess what? It's not the guy. And I think that this just goes to show that this type of reasoning is somewhat impractical, and it's definitely not going to lead to the conclusion of the Zodiac Killer mystery. And I think this will tie in very nicely to the next segment here on the Zodiac Killer News Report. A lot of us watched the documentary His Name Was Arthur Lee Allen, and that features one of the panelists named Dr. Kim Rossmo, who is a criminologist and former police officer. And after I watched the documentary, I particularly liked Dr. Kim Rossmo's performance there, so I decided to look up his material online, and he has lectures on YouTube, and he also wrote the book Criminal Investigative Failures. And I would also like to give a shout out to the criminal profiler Pat Brown, who was discussing Dr. Kim Rossmo and his material in her Zodiac Killer live stream. And she said something that was so honest that I just cannot give her enough credit for. She said that she heard Dr. Kim Rossmo in the documentary. His name was Arthur Lee Allen, and she was impressed by his presentation the same way that I was. So she decided to look at his other material the same way that I did. And she said that it was over her head. It was too smart for her. And I think that is such an honest statement because I had the exact same experience. I am somebody who spends all day, every day exploring true crime content. I don't follow any major mainstream TV shows. I also do not watch a lot of movies unless they're relevant to Black Box Online Radio. I mostly live in the true crime world. And I decided to get Dr. Kim Rossmo's book, Criminal Investigative Failures, and it is extremely advanced and it's extremely dense. I decided to watch his lectures on YouTube, and a lot of them focus on geographic profiling, and they're also very, very advanced, and some of the material was too smart for me. And I really give her credit for saying that. But I was flying back for the Thanksgiving holiday just 2 days ago, actually, and I came from West Virginia, and I got the plane in DC, and then went up to Boston, Massachusetts, where I am right now at the time of this recording. And while I was on the plane, I decided to give his book, Criminal Investigative Failures, another chance. Sure, some of the sections in there are very advanced, and they were over my head, but I found one that really stood out to me, and it was on evidence biases. Already you can see this is some dense material, but he was actually telling the story of a shooting that took place in post-World War I Egypt when it was still a British protectorate. And what happened was, a man was running away from a police officer, and the police officer said he shot him twice because the man was committing a crime. But it turned out that there were 3 bullet holes in the victim's body, that he was shot twice in the chest and stomach area, and then there was also a bullet that went through his leg. So then they thought that the police officer must have been lying, that this person must have made up the story, and that he murdered the assailant for a different reason. And you might be thinking, well, there could be all sorts of explanations as to how and why that took place. Yes, of course, because through forensic examinations, they determined that this officer shot at someone who was running away, who was a suspect in a crime, and that his story was actually true. He shot him twice, but as the man was running, his leg came up in a very high stride, and one bullet went through the man's body and then went into his leg. So that's how it accounted for the 3rd bullet wound, or the 3rd exit and entry point. So the whole point is that even if you have evidence, it can be misleading. Even if you have evidence, it's not only the evidence itself, it's the conclusions that you draw with the evidence. And you have to make sure that the evidence is leading you toward the correct outcome. And this is exactly what Dr. Kim Rossmo was talking about in the documentary. His name was Arthur Lee Allen. You have to use the evidence to lead you to the suspect or the conclusion. And ultimately, that officer was exonerated for that very point. Now, if we're going to talk about investigations, there was a new channel that I found called True Crime Time. I mean, I think it's been online for a while, but I just watched the first video that I've ever seen from True Crime Time yesterday. And it was on the Idaho murders, specifically the murder of Maddie Mogen, who was allegedly, I repeat, allegedly killed by Brian Koberger. And I promise that this is going to tie into the Zodiac Killer for the following reason. Brian Koberger was a criminology student. He was doing his PhD in criminology at Washington State University. And what the person on True Crime Time was asking the audience was, doesn't it seem weird that this criminology student, that this PhD level criminology student would have made so many simple mistakes, like leaving evidence behind, leaving behind a knife sheath with his DNA on it, driving his own car to the crime scene where it could be witnessed not only by people but also by surveillance cameras, let alone his cell phone activity, all types of mistakes that could have been made. Doesn't that seem odd? and that this PhD student in criminology would make these simple mistakes? And my honest answer was no, not at all. And I'm really quite surprised that a channel called True Crime Time would even ask that question. Yeah, you might find some of those personal vloggers out there who once in a while do a true crime segment. Sure, they would ask a question like that, but someone who's actually running a true crime channel, I didn't think that that was an appropriate question for the following reason. Countless times, we see people who are doctors and lawyers and police officers and forensic scientists, toxicologists, like the American Beauty murder, where Dr. Kristen Rossum murdered her husband with poisons from her own lab. She was a toxicologist and she poisoned her husband with chemicals from her own toxicology lab, so it was easily traced back to her. So I think that these types of stories happen all the time. Just because somebody's a PhD student in criminology does not mean that they will not make simple mistakes. And to the credit of True Crime Time, later on in that same video, the host of it did bring up something about how the brain likes to take mental shortcuts. And the reason why the brain takes mental shortcuts is for a type of emotionally pleasing way. It's sort of like creating a fantasy in one's mind where they're going to be playing out the scenario. First, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that. But it's all just about creating the fantasy. And yes, sometimes it can be a dark fantasy. And when I heard the term fantasy, like when people use the word fantasy in the true crime world, I was shocked the first time I heard that because I thought fantasies were good things and talking about murdering people. But let's just use it. When people are acting out imaginary scenarios in their mind, that's a better way of putting it. They're just arranging the events in a way that is pleasing to them. This leads to the creation of mental shortcuts. All of this was shared in True Crime Time, so the host did account for those things later on in the video, and that's it. That's everything. That is so important to these types of investigations. And here's the point where I want to ask you guys a challenge question. Do you believe that the Zodiac killer had a background in criminology? Do you think the Zodiac killer studied criminology? And the reason why I'm asking this is because a lot of you guys in the comments section bring this up when you say things to the effect of, you think that the Zodiac killer was a former member of law enforcement? So let's expand upon that. Did the Zodiac killer have education in criminology? Let's include criminal justice and even similar disciplines. At my university, they had an associate's in police science. Not political science, they had that too, but police science. So any of those similar things, because when you look at the activities of the Zodiac killer, he's also leaving evidence behind. He left behind shell casings at the crime scenes. He left behind ropes at Lake Berryessa when he stabbed Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard. He may have left behind an enormous amount of evidence that we don't truly comprehend to this day at the Stein murder. So the Zodiac is definitely leaving behind evidence. This would all suggest that someone who is not being very methodical and calculating. The Zodiac didn't have to leave those shell casings behind at Lake Herman Road. He could have carried a revolver, for example, as opposed to whatever type of .22 caliber firearm he was using, or the 9mm at Blue Rock Springs, and so on. He didn't have to do that. But when people think that the Zodiac killer had background in law enforcement, it's almost as if they think he knew the things that police would be looking for. He knew how the investigations would be conducted. He wasn't thinking about DNA. He may have coated his fingertips because he knew that he wouldn't want to leave fingerprints behind, coated his fingertips with airplane cement. And I think that the murder of Paul Stein really shows a lot about how the Zodiac killer would have been aware of the crime scenes. And I've talked about this a lot on Black Box Online Radio, so I'll be very brief, that Paul Stein is murdered, and then the Zodiac killer is leaving the crime scene very quickly, not to draw attention to himself. He wore rust-colored pants because maybe that would hide the blood, and it's also reported that he wore a parka-type jacket that could have also concealed other types of blood evidence. So in the past, I was much more in favor of the Zodiac killer being a police officer. In fact, I really thought very highly of it, and I talked to you guys about that a lot here on Black Box Online Radio. But as of now, I think there's insufficient evidence. But I definitely don't think the Zodiac killer was doing a PhD in criminology like Brian Kohberger. That's just an extreme example. The challenge question was, do you think the Zodiac had any type of education in criminology, criminal justice, or a similar field? And right now I would like to get to your supporter shoutouts. You can support this channel at buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88. And that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out here on Zodiac Monday. And our first one comes to us from Batman66. Batman66, thank you so much for your regular and consistent support. Batman bought you a coffee. I never get tired of saying that. And I also have to give credit to Batman66 for helping out a lot with helping find content for this channel. And for a while I was doing the YouTube shorts, and I'm going to resume those in the future. I just had to make the decision about whether I was going to make more YouTube shorts for you guys or continue to do the Ripper Wednesday segment. And perhaps I'll do a little bit of both over the next 4 months, and then I'll get back to the completely regular schedule of shorts and Ripper Wednesday. But yes, every Wednesday I do a segment about Jack the Ripper. And the problem is, though, only focusing on one aspect of the channel or another. I am so far involved with the Ripper mystery. I'm so deeply engrossed in the Ripper case that it's hard to stop, and it's hard to get out of that mindset about, oh, Wednesday's coming, and I genuinely explore the Ripper case on my own. And I've always been really curious about this mystery. So this week there will be a new episode of Ripper Wednesday, and hopefully I'll bring back the YouTube shorts as soon as I can, but I do love talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, even though it's an absolutely horrendous story. And of course, there's also an episode about D.B. Cooper that comes out every Friday. Zodiac Monday, Ripper Wednesday, Cooper Friday, here on Black Box Online Radio. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe. And our next supporter shout-out comes to us from River Prawn Pottery, another very regular and consistent supporter. Thank you so much for everything. I really do appreciate that. And we have CZ Guy, who has also joined the ranks of being a regular and consistent supporter. You three guys are absolutely amazing and everything that you do for Black Box Online Radio. Now, if we're going to talk about the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and D.B. Cooper, then I want to move on to the next segment here on Zodiac Monday. And this is responding to the true crime news, and it relates to a story involving D.B. Cooper and a parachute that was found by Dan Grider, who runs the YouTube channel Probable Cause. I think the full name is Probable Cause Dan Grider Probable Cause, something to that effect. But the name of his show is Probable Cause. And he makes user-generated documentaries. And he has been appearing all over the news networks. He was even on CNN talking about how he has found D.B. Cooper's parachute. But the reason why I'm bringing this up on Zodiac Monday is I want to talk about how the news media responds to these types of stories. Because, like I said on the last Cooper Friday, if you didn't hear that episode, you will find countless episodes and countless articles that have been written about Dan Grider and this discovery of D.B. Cooper's parachute. But every article that I brought up on Cooper Friday said they may have found D.B. Cooper's parachute. And you're going to see a lot of this in the Zodiac Killer mystery, because you're going to always find people who are saying they may have had a DNA match between the Zodiac Killer and their suspect. They may have had a fingerprint match between the Zodiac Killer and their suspect. They may have identified the Zodiac Killer. Mainstream news articles love to do this all the time, but if you read things like that, usually it's false. Usually it's something that does not have a lot of substance. Usually it's something that does not have a lot of weight to carry. Usually it's something that is just out there to get clicks and views and to get attention. And if that is the sole purpose of the MSN, they're doing it right. If they just want more attention for themselves, they're doing it right. But I honestly think that it's very misleading. And you are going to see stuff like this. Say, for example, the Case Breakers in 2021 when they brought their suspect Gary Francis Post forward. And somebody even responded to my most recent Cooper Friday episode saying, this Dan Grider guy who says that he's found D.B. Cooper's parachute, he reminds me of the Case Breakers. And to Dan Grider's credit, I think that he is way above the Case Breakers in terms of his ability to articulate the D.B. Cooper case, and in terms of the actual information and material that he puts out. It is better than Tom Colbert. It's not only the D.B. Cooper stuff, but specifically the Zodiac Killer stuff. It is absolutely better than everything that Tom Colbert has created. There is definitely a lot more thought and a lot more research that goes into Dan Grider's material. That being said, I think he's wrong about everything. he may have found D.B. Cooper's parachute. Why don't you guys come to us? By you guys, I mean the MSM. Why don't you guys come to us when you actually have conclusive findings and something to report on, as opposed to just creating media firestorms for clicks? But to continue with the show here, I want to get into the world of true crime talk. And there is something that I would like to discuss with you guys. And that is that I follow the show Crime Talk, which is hosted by Scott Reich, and he is a practicing defense attorney. And I confess that this is getting out of the Zodiac waters for a little bit. But he made a very bold statement that was both sad and sardonic. And it related to how people perceive the defendants at a trial, like specifically the jury members. The statement was that when the defendant takes the stand at a jury trial, it just comes down to whether or not they like his personality or her personality, whether or not they like him or her as a person. And that statement really hit me, because it's not about evidence at that point. It's not about forensics, and it's not about the discussion. It all just comes back to emotions and sex. And yes, of course, there are cases that have some very strong and compelling pieces of evidence, but there are also cases where it seems like somebody could be guilty or not guilty, and it just comes down to a personality assessment that's done by the jury when the defendant takes the stand. Again, I think a lot of us were very much aware of that, but at the same time, just when someone lays it out for you like that, especially a practicing attorney, it's somewhat of a downtrodden moment. And I think that a very big example of this is the Apple River stabbings. Because another true crime video that I watched recently was the documentary that was made by Minneapolis St. Paul 9, and that's available here on YouTube. It's called Convicting Nikolai Mew, who is now referred to as the Apple River Killer. And he is someone who was caught on video stabbing multiple people at the Apple River in Wisconsin. And the cool thing was that it's all on video, and then it's about physical evidence, it's about videographic evidence, because his claim was self-defense, that not only was he actually under the threat of physical violence, that some people may have been physical with him first, and if they threw the first punch, then he would have the right to defend himself. But he was ultimately convicted for stabbing multiple people. One of them, named Isaac Schumann, passed away. That's why he's referred to as the Apple River Killer. And Nikolai Mew was sentenced to 20 years in prison earlier this year. But this documentary, again, just watching this right after Crime Talk, this documentary was saying that the reason why he was convicted was the jury didn't like him on the stand. Everything that Scott Reich said on Crime Talk came to fruition in the documentary Convicting Nikolai Mew. And that's the saddening aspect of it. Like, they're saying that, oh, well, they believed him when he was telling this part of the story. They didn't believe him when he was telling that part of the story. And they have some reasons for that, because in the Apple River stabbing case, Nikolai Mew, the defendant, the accused, he was changing his story multiple times. He tried to avoid the whole situation. He changed his clothes after the stabbing. He cleaned and threw away the murder weapon. He was acting like he was guilty. But my whole stance was, we have the videos. We saw the entire encounter. We know what's going on. And here's another point that people don't seem to comprehend. Even if somebody is innocent, they might change their story. Even if somebody is innocent, they might even insert some lies into their story. They do this because they are afraid. They do this because they think that people won't believe them. Or in the case of Nikolai Mew, he may have actually had some reasons for this. What he said on the witness stand in the documentary was, well, this is from the Courtroom, but he's featured in the documentary. He said that he did it because he was overwhelmed with emotion, because he had just been involved in a physical attack, and he pulled out a knife and he stabbed people, but he did it in self-defense, and he did all those things simply because he was just overwhelmed with emotion. And there might actually be some truth to that. But no matter what, he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And that's just a tragedy all around. And this is one thing that Dr. Todd Grande said about the Apple River stabbing, and that is just that It happened because of a lack of empathy. I know I don't always say good things about Dr. Todd Grande, but I think he got this one right. There was no empathy. Those are his words, not mine, but I agree with them. That just all sides in that issue are just featuring the assailant who was not being aware at all of how he was making other people feel, the people who were ultimately the victims were not being aware at all about how they were creating and instigating a dangerous situation, no empathy all around. But the reason why I'm discussing it here on Zodiac Monday is it relates to the trial aspect of this. I've talked a lot about forensics in this episode. I've talked a lot about investigations. But this is the courtroom aspect of this. And you really have to wonder if somebody's going to be on trial for murder for something such as the Zodiac killer crimes one day. Imagine if they took the stand and it all turned into a personality contest. Well, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Zodiac Monday. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is Ned Dahan. There's also a page for this show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and you can read about the show at zodiackillercode.com. One more time, zodiackillercode.com, and there is blackboxned88 over on Instagram, and I will see you over there. Goodbye.